Okay. We all know that nobody besides Team Edgar Berlanga and perhaps Canelo Alvarez wanted this fight. We get it. And we've been clamoring for some time now for a Canelo versus David Benavidez fight. And most fight fans have been pretty dissatisfied with this last run of Canelo Alvarez opponents, even though, I mean, Jaime Munguia is a really good fighter. But we all know that Canelo versus Berlanga isn't ideal. But I think that if you strip back the context in which this fight was made and the fact that most people are mad because, one, we're not getting the Canelo fight that we want, but also it seems like Edgar Berlanga is being awarded simply for being a big name, even if he doesn't have a resume to deserve this fight. So I think that him getting this golden ticket rubs a lot of fight fans the wrong way, especially because Canelo was basically saying that David Benavidez, at first he was saying that Benavidez doesn't deserve the shot and somehow made it sound like he hasn't done enough to deserve the shot. But then he justified giving Jaime Munguia, who's done less than Benavidez, giving him a shot, and now he's giving Edgar Berlanga a shot. And Berlanga's best opponents have been Petrack McCrory and maybe Jason Quigley or Damon Nicholson, Marcelo Caceres. So there are so many things to be upset with about this Canelo versus Berlanga fight. But again, I think that if you strip back the context surrounding this fight is actually a little bit intriguing. Like, first of all, anytime Canelo fights, I think it's worth a watch. I think that sometimes we do have an unrealistic expectation when it comes to the A+ level fighters on what their fight-by-fight schedule should look like. And Canelo has fought many of the great fighters of this generation and of the last generation. And no one could take away those back-to-back fights versus Triple G, regardless if you thought Canelo won the fight, fought to a draw, or deserved to lose the fight. He was in there for those 24 rounds. I know he fought him a third time, but in terms of prime or near prime Triple G, Canelo was in there with him, fighting relatively evenly for those 24 rounds without hitting the canvas once. And no naysayer can take that away from Canelo Alvarez. Not to mention, when he fought Callum Smith, I thought that was a dangerous opponent. I thought that Dimitri Bivol, even though Canelo was a big favorite at the time against Bivol, I thought that was an excellent quality of opponent. So yes, this last stretch has been pretty uninspiring. But it's not like Canelo's fighting an outright bum. It just appears to be somebody who has no business in the ring with Canelo Alvarez. So instead of approaching this fight like I approach most of these fight previews, I'm gonna more so discuss if Edgar Berlanga has a shot in hell at winning this fight and what he needs to do to beat Canelo Alvarez, or at least to make this fight super competitive. And then at the end, I'll still give my prediction on who's gonna win this fight, who I think is gonna win this fight, and how. So we've got Canelo Alvarez, 61 wins, 2 losses, and 2 draws, defending his WBA, WBC, and WBO super middleweight titles. Remember, he got stripped of the IBF belt, so he's no longer undisputed, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, he was undisputed for a minute, and when it comes to Canelo's, the belts really don't matter. He's in that stratosphere of fighter. But he's going to be defending his remaining 168-pound titles against Edgar Berlanga, 22 wins and 0 losses. And remember, Edgar Berlanga rose to fame because his first 16 fights resulted in 16 first-round knockouts. Not just knockouts, but first-round knockouts, which I don't care who you are. Point to another fighter who's done that. That was such an outlier that it basically bought him this last stretch of a few fights where there's still some mystique around Edgar Berlanga, even though, you know, aside from stopping Petrack McCrory in his last fight, TKOing him in 6 rounds, it pretty much bought him that last stretch of a few fights where he had like 5 or 6 unanimous decision wins and no knockouts in a row. And I just want to pause here because I just have to tell you from a personal standpoint, you might not have seen as much activity on my channel as usual. Our first child, our baby boy, was just born a couple of days ago. So he's about 2.5 days old right now. I literally just cut the wristbands from the hospital off my wrist yesterday. So it's been a heck of a week. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that in future videos, kind of give you the story and what this experience was like, you know, having our first child. But spoiler alert, and I know many of you have already had kids, but this was nothing short of remarkable. So yeah, it's been quite a last few days. But let's dive into Canelo versus Berlanga. So Berlanga had that run that kind of drove his star power, and he's one of these guys who I think, the way I interpret it, he got famous before he got really, really good. And now he's been spending his last few fights trying to get really, really good and trying to get his skills to catch up with his fame. I was saying something similar about Ryan Garcia pretty recently, but I think that it's been even more exaggerated with Edgar Berlanga. I mean, he's not nearly the star that Ryan Garcia is, but there is no Luke Campbell thus far in Edgar Berlanga's resume. Yet here we sit with this Canelo versus Berlanga upcoming fight. So I actually think that this fight is at least more competitive than the betting odds. As it stands right now, check this out. Canelo is a minus 1450 and Edgar Berlanga is a plus 1000. That means Edgar Berlanga is a 10-1 underdog against Canelo. They're really giving Edgar Berlanga next to no shot here. And I know that many of you are giving him next to no shot as well. And there's really good reason for that. Again, you look at his resume, he's got nothing nearly, like, he is not a top 15 opponent for Canelo Alvarez. I mean, maybe top 15, but maybe not. Like, is he better than the version of Alfredo Angulo that Canelo fought? Is he better than James Kirkland at the time that Canelo fought Kirkland? I don't know. And I think that it's a mix between that and the fact that he's kind of a loudmouth, trash talking Brooklyn Boricua. So I think that a lot of people see, you know, how he kind of conducts himself and how he kind of, you know, talks disrespectfully like a lot of New Yorkers do. And then they see Berlanga with this huge, again, golden ticket opportunity. But if you look at the attributes that he's bringing to the table here, he's young, he's a strong dude, and he's an actual native 168 pounder. Like, if you look at a lot of Canelo's recent opponents, John Ryder, former 160 pound fighter, Jermell Charlo was moving up from 154. Jaime Munguia was a former 154 pound belt holder. So like when Munguia was in his early 20s, he was at 154. Triple G, a middleweight. Dimitri Bivol was a big guy, right? He was 175. You know, he's a relatively small 175, but he's a true light heavyweight. So there is Bivol, and Caleb Plant is a native 168 pounder, but Billy Joe Saunders, he was 154, 160. But yeah, Edgar Berlanga is a true 168, and he's a strong one. I think that Edgar Berlanga has to at least bring the nastiness that he has in the ring with Canelo. Like, if he comes in against Canelo and is trying to tap gloves after every round and is trying to respect Canelo in the ring, he's just gonna get disrespected and it's gonna be all Canelo. It might make for a pretty boring fight where Edgar Berlanga looks reluctant to engage. Either the lights get too bright for him or just the magnitude of the moment. You've got Canelo standing across the ring from you. Maybe he just becomes a humble jabber, a mover where he's stepping back and is not willing to exchange with Canelo. We see that with a lot of fighters who end up being in way over their head when they fight a top-notch elite fighter. We saw it with Jermell Charlo. I didn't think we were gonna get that out of Jermell Charlo. I mean, to me, you know, he kind of embodied that warrior spirit. And then we see him put up that type of a performance against Canelo. So we might get that with Edgar Berlanga. You know, I thought that we might have gotten that with Jaime Munguia. We didn't. We got Jaime Munguia trying to pour on some offense against Canelo. So Edgar Berlanga, pretty strong fighter, and I actually do think that with some of these unanimous decision wins, he was showing some skill building. I mean, there were certain fights where it was like, damn, is he kind of regressing? Like the fight against Jason Quigley, where he won a decision, but he was getting outboxed for a lot of that fight against Quigley. But then you see him fight, you know, Steve Rolls a couple fights before that. And then this last fight against Petrag McCrory, which was one of his best performances. I think that that might have been his best performance outside of that 16 fight first round knockout streak. You started to see him put his power punches together against McCrory, who again is probably one of Berlanga's best opponents and is not a bad fighter, but he's good by UK regional standards. McCrory hasn't shown himself to be an elite world-class fighter, at least to this point. So Berlanga, I think he's got to bring the nastiness that he showed when he gets frustrated in certain fights. Like against Romer Alexis Angulo, he bit the guy when he was getting repeatedly frustrated. Now, I'm not suggesting that he go in there and bite Canelo. That's a good way to get one disqualified or piss Canelo off and you just get knocked spark out, as they say. But he also got nasty against Petrak McCrory when he kind of was in the clinch and he threw an elbow. He was getting kind of knocked around a little bit in the clinch and then he threw a nasty elbow, which, you know, he should have gotten a point deducted, I thought, because it was a blatant elbow. So there is a nastiness, but it's also a sign that he doesn't know how to handle frustration. And he wouldn't be the first Brooklyn New Yorker we've seen that from. I mean, Zab Judah showed some of those attributes. I mean, Mike Tyson bit Evander Holyfield. I don't know if it's a Brooklyn thing, no disrespect, but I mean, I'm just citing the references that I could think of here. But you do want to bring some of that nastiness. You don't want to respect Canelo. I mean, you want to respect his power where you're not just going head over skis trying to hunt Canelo down, but that hasn't been Edgar Berlanga's MO since that knockout streak. He's been much more patient in his last 6 or so fights. Now, when it comes to Berlanga's jab, sometimes I think that it's getting better. Other times I think that he's regressing, and other times I'm not quite sure. If he can control range, because when other guys pursue him, he's pretty good at jumping back. Now, he doesn't have fast feet. Neither does Canelo. So this is going to be two relatively slow-footed guys, but Canelo's got great foot placement. Don't get the two attributes confused. Edgar Berlanga, he's able to hop back pretty well, like to get out of range. If he could get out of range and then pop a educated jab and find Canelo, it's one thing to throw a jab out there, but if you ain't hitting nothing, all you're doing is making yourself more vulnerable and you are giving the other guy more and more opportunities to counter you if you've got a jab that's not working effectively. So Berlanga, he could jump out of the pocket pretty well. He could jump in the pocket fairly well, but sometimes he doesn't put enough punches together. I would like to see him try to throw 3 punches, 2 or 3 punches at a time, or even a 4th punch when you're throwing your combinations against Canelo. But don't get over eager. Step back and then start popping a 1-punch jab at a time, or even double up on the jab, but don't let Canelo just counter you over the top or throw a hook to the body or do anything to dissuade you from letting your hands go. If Edgar Berlanga can, 1, find opportunities to clinch, make Canelo use his legs, walk the older fighter around the ring a little bit, bully him a bit, and throw some punches in the clinch, get nasty with them, and then get back on a jab and move. Make Canelo find you in a lot of different occasions. And I was saying the same thing about what would be a good strategy for Jaime Munguia, but then find different opportunities to really pour on some offense where you could back Canelo up, hopefully, get Canelo to put up that high guard and either try to punch around or through the guard, make Canelo say, no, you didn't get to me, but put Canelo on his back foot in moments and then get back to your back foot game where Canelo's trying to walk you down as long as you're not getting walk down, and go to Canelo's body. He's going to try to go to your body. He's going to try to punish you. Go to his body. Don't let him forget who the younger, seemingly or supposedly stronger and bigger guy is in this ring. Don't let him forget that. But I think that Jaime Munguia is a lot better at jumping in and out and throwing, 3 to 4 punches at a time than Edgar Berlanga is. Jaime Munguia is a little bit more happy foot. He's a little bit more agile. He likes jumping in and getting that madness, that activity going, and then coming back out. Edgar Berlanga is a lot more of kind of like a, he just likes to sort of pose and take pictures a lot if he's not getting the upper hand from a boxing perspective. And here's the problem. If he was having trouble boxing with Petrak McCrory in different moments, yes, he again did finish him in the 6th, but if he was having some issues boxing him and having issues boxing Jason Quigley, I just don't see how he could get comfortable letting his hands go and trying to win rounds against Canelo. Is it going to be feast or famine for Edgar Berlanga because I didn't necessarily think that it was feast or famine for Jaime Munguia. I thought that Jaime Munguia had a good chance at winning rounds. If he gets volume going, you start backing Canelo up, Canelo might not be able to match your volume. And if you could take Canelo's, it's Canelo's power, and you could reduce the amounts of times that Canelo's landing super cleanly and you're just walking into Canelo's power, if you could out volume him, you could win rounds. I don't necessarily think that Edgar Berlanga is able to do that. So it feels a little bit more feast or famine for Berlanga in this one, which isn't a good sign. Because what are the chances that you're going to knock Canelo out? Like, how often do you see Canelo hurt? Aside from when he fought, Miguel Cotto's brother, like way back in the day, but basically before he got famous, before Canelo got famous, I haven't seen him truly rocked since. And again, he's been in there several times with Triple G. So I think that Edgar Berlanga is going to have to find a way to win some rounds. Like, maybe he could pull a rabbit out of his hat, and he does have the power where he can really thump. It's possible that he could catch Canelo with, with a hook, maybe double up a hook, throw one hook to the body. Maybe you guys both let a hook go at the same time, and your first hook was low, and then you throw a hook up top following the low hook, and maybe you catch Canelo with that and could get him on wobbly legs. But again, that would be like some pull a rabbit out of the hat scenario. It's a lot more likely that Canelo, even being low volume, is going to be walking you down, and you're going to be a little bit spooked and intimidated by what he might or might not throw. Canelo, kind of coming in with the high guard and kind of fainting you out of position. Now, Berlanga, he's got a good amateur pedigree. He sparred with a lot of good fighters, came up in a good program. He's been in the ring sparring with a lot of, great fighters as he was a youngin' coming up. So he's seen people faint, but again, it's one thing when you're coming up in the amateur system. It's another thing when you're in there with Canelo with no headgear on. And Berlanga, I believe, has sparred Canelo in the past. But again, it's another thing when you're in an actual fight where every punch can potentially change your career, essentially. So again, Edgar Berlanga, I think, needs to mix up the back foot and front foot game. I think he needs to go to Canelo's body. I think he has to find a way to get his jab to work. And you being Berlanga, being the younger guy, even if you're not naturally a high volume guy, you've got to be higher volume than Canelo. You've got to outwork Canelo. You've got to make Canelo start looking a little bit disheveled and looking like he's in some sort of physical distress trying to keep up with you. You've got to make this fight take on that type of a complexion to even have a chance here. Now, is he going to be able to do that against a very economical puncher who doesn't waste too many punches? Like, when Canelo wastes a punch, it's because he threw a strategic throwaway punch to run you into a bigger punch. But he's not somebody who's gonna like pepper you with jabs or poke and prod and throw like 4 to 5 somewhat meaningless punches at a time. I mean, that's what kept Gennady looking like he was arguably winning the first and second fight. It was that Gennady Golovkin was the higher volume guy, which, by the way, if my son wasn't born a couple days ago, I was actually gonna do a recap and a kind of a re-litigation of the first fight between Triple G and Canelo, because and I will probably, if not before this fight, I'll do it before Canelo's next fight, assuming that Canelo wins this one. And one of the points that I was making there was that our perception going in was that Triple G was going to be the hunter and Canelo was going to be the hunted. Now, in the first fight, it was Canelo who was backing up, who was not matching Triple G's volume, but was looking for nice counter-punching opportunities. But it was just interesting for even in that first fight, like the first 2 rounds, in my opinion, changed the whole story between these two guys of the first fight, where you saw that Triple G was not able to land his best stuff against Canelo, so he was relegated to becoming a jab-heavy fighter. And I'm just sitting here watching this like, when did Triple G become a jab-dominant fighter? Like, he's always had a good jab, but to have to rely on the jab because your fastball isn't connecting, that changed things, where it was Canelo who was splashing with the more eye-catching punches, and it was Triple G who was tripling up with the jab. I was just not expecting that. So we're gonna talk more in a future video about that first fight between Triple G and Canelo. But don't get me wrong, Berlanga cannot, in my opinion, execute a Triple G type of strategy. He just doesn't throw enough punches to make that happen. He doesn't have enough belief in his fastball, which is ironic coming from a guy who knocked out 16 straight opponents in the first round. But he doesn't seem comfortable enough to really let his best stuff go unless you're a sitting target or unless he's already got you hurt and he doesn't respect your power. He's got to respect Canelo's power. But here's another thing here. Canelo, when he was fighting Triple G, when he was fighting Daniel Jacobs, Callum Smith, in a lot of Canelo's earlier fights, and this is even late in Canelo's career, but in Canelo's earlier fights, like let's say anything before the Dimitri Bivol fight, like so from Caleb Plant and before, Canelo's had really good trunk movement and good head movement where it's not easy to connect with him up top. It's not so much the case with him anymore. Like even if you look at his fight against Jaime Munguia, yes, he was slipping some punches, but not in the way that he was slipping punches back in the day. He was more so picking off and catching a lot more of Munguia's punches. He just doesn't have, I don't believe he's got the reflexes that he used to have. Now he's in like his near mid 30s. He turned 34 in July. So I don't think that he's got the reflexes or the energy, especially in the second half of the fight. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. But Canelo, even if he does still look kind of fresh and still look kind of smooth and slick in the early rounds, his ability to be that elusive, especially with his legs, lower back, being a little bit older, he's not able to do that in the second half of fights. So if Berlanga is able to keep the first half of the fight competitive and doesn't get dropped or hurt badly in the first half of the fight, like Munguia did. When did Munguia get dropped? I think it might have been like the 5th round or so. If Berlanga could avoid getting shaken up, right, getting spooked and hurt against Canelo in the first half, and it's a competitive fight, and then has the energy to start pouring it on from rounds, let's say 5, 6, throughout much of the second half of the fight, then we have something interesting where you've got the older and less elusive by Canelo's standards. You've got the older Canelo who is probably still up by a round or 2 on the cards, but you are starting to put your foot on the gas and he's starting to look a little bit more drained and a little bit more weary. If we could get there, we've got something. I just think that it's very unlikely that the first 5 to 6 rounds play out like that. I feel like by round 6, we're gonna kind of get what's going on between these two guys. I think that Canelo will have asserted himself enough to where he's got Berlanga either backing up or already hurt and in trouble. So I think that by then, I'm expecting Berlanga to either be patient, willing to touch gloves, a lot more respectful, a lot less Brooklyn, you know what I mean? And just a lot more deferential to the future Hall of Famer Canelo, or he will have been dropped already, he being Berlanga, and is maybe on the verge of getting stopped. I am gonna kind of side with the former. I think that we might get a couple exciting moments where it looks like Berlanga got brave enough to throw a few hard punches. I think we might have some spots where he's able to, and we might get some interesting exchanges where Berlanga might even clip Canelo with something big. I just think that it's going to be Canelo who ends up walking Berlanga down and kind of putting a beating over the course of 12 rounds on Edgar Berlanga. Not too dissimilar from what Canelo did with Jaime Munguia. I think we might get a knockdown here, but I think that Berlanga, being a big guy, being a young guy, Canelo being a bit older, I don't think Canelo's gonna get the stoppage here. I think that Berlanga's gonna do enough to survive this one. I think that it's gonna trigger a lot of groans and a lot of dismay from the boxing public. I mean, he might have some, like, I feel like the way that Munguia lost, even though it was via decision, he didn't totally go out on his shield, but he at least gave something throughout much of that fight to where the fight was interesting. And you saw that Jaime Munguia was really going for it. I think that Berlanga will come close to giving it that much, but will stop short of really selling out and coming forward in the first half of the fight in the way that Munguia did. But again, Berlanga's a more patient fighter, at least in these last several fights, than Jaime Munguia is. So again, there's an outside chance that Berlanga boxes patiently and then starts picking up the aggression, which again would make this very interesting. I just think that again, Canelo's gonna more or less be having his way by the time we hit the midway point of this fight, and Canelo's gonna run away on the scorecards with a wide unanimous decision win over Edgar Berlanga. So yeah, I'm picking Canelo to win via wide unanimous decision here. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this one. Let me know your thoughts on the state of the 168-pound division. I feel like win or lose, depending on how Berlanga competes here, he will still be able to have big fights going forward. I mean, he's a big name coming into this one. Again, without having the resume to kind of prove that he deserved this type of opportunity. But we get, I mean, even with the great Floyd Mayweather, we saw him fight, you know, Robert the Ghost Guerrero, who at least had a belt. You know what I mean? Guerrero did more than Berlanga did to deserve a shot against Floyd Mayweather. Berlanga is just a name. He's really just a name who's, you know, been an A-side fighter. So commercially, yeah, he's headlined a couple cards now. But resume-wise, opponent-wise, he really doesn't deserve this one. Like, I think that he's more in the ballpark of a Christian Mabili. I think that that's, and Christian Mabili is like a very highly ranked 168 pounder. So it's not like Berlanga's far off. I mean, the only guys who have done noticeably more were David Benavidez, who's now up a division, Caleb Plant, who's, you know, lost a couple and hasn't been very active lately. And then you've got like Jaime Munguia. Diego Pacheco hasn't done more than Berlanga, but I think that people have an overall higher opinion of Diego Pacheco. But, you know, life's not always fair, and Berlanga, for this reason and that reason, ends up being the bigger name. And so again, here we go. But yeah, let me know what you think about this fight, and what do you think the aftermath of this fight's gonna be? So we're in September. Will Canelo have that end of the year fight? I mean, if he doesn't get too banged up here, will the 34-year-old Canelo be able to have a 4-month turnaround and return to the ring in December? I kind of have my doubts. Canelo isn't a spring chicken. He's not even as, I don't even think he's able to do what he was able to do in that great 2021 when he beat Callum Smith at the end of 2020, and then he rattled off the wins against Avni Yildirim, Billy Joe Saunders, and Caleb Plant all in one calendar year. I don't think that he's young enough and fresh enough to be able to fight on that type of schedule. So I have my doubts on whether he's going to return to the ring by December. People are kind of hoping that we get Canelo Crawford in December. But yeah, stay tuned. I'm hopeful, since I don't believe Canelo is going to fight David Benavidez anytime soon. I am hopeful that Canelo fights Crawford in December. But yeah, let me know what you think, depending on how this fight plays out, the future, the immediate future of both of these fighters is gonna be. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog, thanks for tuning in.